Iran's President Hassan Rouhani says U.S. efforts to impose a permanent UN arms embargo against Iran are in violation of the Security Council resolution and the Iran nuclear deal. Rouhani made the remarks during a phone call with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron. Rouhani also stressed the U.S. is not entitled to use the snapback mechanism stipulated in the 2015 deal since Washington pulled out of the agreement some 2 years ago. Rouhani warned the European signatories not to fall into America's trap, expressing hope that they stay committed to the nuclear deal and the UN resolution. The French president also said that his country's view on the extension of the Iran arms embargo is completely different from that of the U.S. and that Paris has explicitly stated the issue to Washington. Joining us now for this news review is Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher and editor at Politics First from London, and Ramiro Fuentes, co-editor of Anticonquista, joining us from Los Angeles. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, we're going to start with you. Your thoughts on the story, sir?
Well, this is another flagrant attempt by the Americans to undermine the Iran nuclear deal, an agreement that has done a great deal in restoring a degree of peace and stability to the Middle East, which is, after all, the most volatile part of the world. And whilst the American attempt will fail, because Russia at the United Nations Security Council will object to it and will veto it, nonetheless, the spotlight will fall on the Europeans, because Iran wants to see the Europeans truly support the JCPOA. And if the Europeans fail, if they fail to speak out against the American, what is ultimately an ultimatum, then that will hardly be conducive to reassuring Iran that the Europeans will be steadfast permanently in their support of the JCPOA. And I sincerely hope that the Europeans, in particular France and Germany, because we have to remember that Britain is merely a vassal state of America, but I sincerely hope that Berlin and Paris will show to the Americans and will demonstrate to Iran that they have a backbone and that they will not tolerate any threats or intimidation by the Americans, and thereby will full-heartedly support the Iran nuclear deal. But it should also be said that in the Middle East, we now see a strategic partnership between Russia and Iran developing very nicely, which is going to do a great deal for the region in terms of countering the malignant effects of American, Saudi, and Syrian and Israeli domination of the region. And let us not forget that the Russians are very keen to start supplying Iran with conventional weapons. That will be good for the strategic partnership between Tehran and Moscow. And of course, it will enhance Iran's already very formidable defense capabilities.
Thank you, Marcus. And Ramiro, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Your initial thoughts on this, Ramiro?
I think Marcus laid it out very well. I think this is obviously a ploy by the Trump administration and his backers in Tel Aviv and quote-unquote Jerusalem to disarm, to weaken Iran. We already see the U.S. imperialists taking advantage of the situation in Lebanon and somehow tie it into Iran, somehow blame Iran for being involved in some way. They're also trying to do the same thing with Russia. And so I think we have to understand the forced disarmament and the forced weakening of Iran by the U.S. imperialists within this context of Israeli expansionism, of a U.S. empire in decline, and an increasingly unpopular Israel. And it's no surprise that this comes at a time when Iran signs one of its biggest trade deals with the People's Republic of China, that allows for win-win cooperation, that circumnavigates Wall Street and London, which have dominated the Middle East for so long. And now that China and Iran are cooperating, building an alternative society that's separate from Wall Street and London, they're doing all they can to weaken Iran, to encirculate it, to disarm it, and to paint it as the bad guy. And unfortunately, I expect within the next few weeks to see more imperialist propaganda directed against Iran.
But Ramiro, I'm sure you well know that Donald Trump signed that executive order, opted out of the JCPOA back in May of 2018. The Europeans have had, over 2 years and a couple months to get their act together for the preservation of the JCPOA. So while Emmanuel Macron, is talking a big talk, what have the Europeans really done in the last 2 years plus to preserve that accord?
Well, I think there's some division within the Europeans in terms of Iran. I think there are sectors of European society that want to trade with Iran, that recognize that Iran, China, Russia, and other countries that are moving away from Wall Street represent the future. And I think that we see that manifesting in certain European countries that have more populist movements. I think when we're talking about like France, England, and certain states that are more loyal to Wall Street and London and U.S. capitalism in general, I think they're obviously going to stick with their allies. But I think Europe is really divided at this point. I think there's a growing number of people who want to trade with Iran, who recognize that the JCPOA, Iran did all it can to comply with it. It went above and beyond the standards, and yet the Americans still were unable to follow through with their promise. And so I think we're going to see more Europeans pushing for cooperation with Iran.
Thank you, Ramiro. And Marcus, I'm going to let you get the last word in. How much can Tehran bank on the Europeans? Mainly, you referred to London as a vassal state for the U.S., but even when it comes to Paris and Berlin, how much can Iran count on them going forward?
Well, ultimately, France and Germany are strategic allies to America. Now, the ordinary French person and the ordinary German person does not have a particularly favorable opinion of the Americans, but nonetheless, the French and the German elites are strategic allies to Washington. And we have seen in the last year in particular, Paris and Berlin come under immense American pressure. The Americans are attempting to intimidate the French and the Germans from trading with Iran, from investing in Iran, by saying to the Germans and the French that if you keep on having business dealings with the Iranians, then that will jeopardize your access to the American market, a market of 300 million people. And whilst the Iranian market is a very attractive one, of course, it cannot compete with the American market. And therein lies the problem, that when push comes to shove, the Germans and the French could turn to the American market. And in that scenario, that is when the JCPOA could be truly dead. But we have to bear in mind that the Europeans did introduce the Instex trading system, which was a boost, a significant boost for the JCPOA, because it allows Iran, for example, to export oil. And Tehran was very pleased with that development. Nonetheless, as I said moments ago, the Germans and the French need to demonstrate to the international arena that they have a moral backbone. They signed up to the JCPOA, and they must not allow any country in the world to undermine an agreement that they are signatories to.
All right, Marcus, I have to double check on that. I'm not sure Instex works for oil transactions, but I'm going to double check and get back to you on that. Gentlemen, we're out of time. I want to thank you both for joining us. Always a pleasure to have both of you on and get your respective perspectives on things. Marcus Papadopoulos out of London and Ramiro Funes out of Anticonquista joining us from Los Angeles. And viewers, that is a wrap for your latest here on Press TV. Thanks for tuning in for our news review program, and bye-bye for now.